The morning after Pearl Harbor, the Pacific smelled of burning oil and salt. The sun came up through a haze of drifting smoke, and on the deck of the USS Gudgeon, tied up at Mare Island, crewmen watched the newspaper boys shouting from the docks. One headline stretched across the wet newsprint, "War in the Pacific." That same morning in Washington, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Harold R. Stark signed a brief, unadorned memorandum that would change the character of the American war at sea. It authorized unrestricted submarine warfare against all Japanese shipping, a phrase that meant the Navy's undersea fleet, once bound by prize rules and formal warning, would now strike without notice. No quarter, no flags, no lights. Just silence, periscope, and torpedo. By Christmas, U.S. submarines were sailing west. The Gudgeon, a 1,475-ton Gato-class submarine under Lieutenant Commander Elton W. Grenfell, received orders to patrol Japanese home waters, the first American submarine to do so after the attack. She departed Pearl Harbor on the 31st of January 1942, still smelling faintly of oil fires. Below decks, the crew counted 68 men, 3 Mark 14 torpedoes to each forward tube, and the uneasy knowledge that the ocean between them and the enemy was almost the size of a continent. The Pacific in early 1942 was an empire's highway. Japan's war economy pulsed through 6 million tons of merchant shipping coal from Formosa, bauxite from the Indies, oil from Borneo, food from China, all sailing unescorted, unarmored, and unafraid. The Imperial Navy still believed its destroyers and cruisers were for battle, not for guarding slow cargo tubs. Convoy discipline was nearly non-existent, radio codes were lax, merchant captains often sailed alone, trusting the vastness of the ocean to hide them. For the men of Gudgeon, that arrogance was both an opportunity and a curse. They hunted by sound, by shadow, by intuition. Days went by, with nothing but the hum of the motors and the soft ticking of sonar. Then contact. A Japanese freighter, likely a Maru, appeared across the scope at 1,800 yards, a perfect angle on the bow. The fire control officer set the torpedo depth and gyro angle. Grenfell gave the order to fire. The first Mark 14 left the tube in a rush of air, the hiss echoing through the hull. The seconds dragged. The men in the control room listened. 1, 2, 3, silence, no explosion. A second torpedo followed, and again, nothing. The freighter, unharmed, altered course, and vanished into the sea haze. It was the same story across the fleet. The Seawolf, the Pollack, the Sculpin all stalked their targets and fired, only to watch the enemy sail calmly away. In the dim red light of control rooms, disbelief turned to fury. Officers suspected bad aim, bad settings, bad luck. But as weeks passed, a darker truth emerged. The torpedoes themselves were defective. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington had designed the Mark 14 with a complex magnetic exploder meant to detonate beneath a ship's keel. In theory, it was elegant, the pressure wave would break a vessel's back. In practice, the detonators misfired, the depth-keeping mechanisms were faulty, and the magnetic pistols triggered prematurely or not at all. In a letter preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency archives, one frustrated skipper wrote, "We have fired at least 5 torpedoes under perfect solution. All ran deep, one was recovered and tested. It struck the target at 10 feet below set depth. The men are losing faith." By March 1942, the statistics were damning. Of the 98 torpedoes fired by U.S. subs in the first 4 months of war, less than a quarter functioned properly. Many ran more than 10 feet too deep. Some detonated halfway to the target. Others struck with a dull thud and failed to explode. Meanwhile, Japanese freighters continued to move unchallenged across the South China Sea and Philippine waters. They carried rice, petroleum, and munitions that sustained the rapid conquests in Malaya and the Netherlands Indies. The Imperial Navy reported only minor interference from American submarines. Tokyo's merchant fleet managers barely adjusted their schedules. The confidence was almost serene. Yet below that surface calm, the U.S. Silent Service was learning painfully, scientifically. Engineers at Pearl Harbor began dissecting recovered warheads, Commanders exchanged notes in secret, sharing firing angles and detonation anomalies despite official reprimand. The mood inside the boats shifted from shame to determination, a passage from the U.S. Navy Submarine Force Pacific War Diary, January 1942, recorded the frustration in spare Navy prose. Several commanding officers report repeated failures of torpedo detonation. Morale remains high, though confidence in ordnance is low. Until remedy, success in the offensive will depend more on audacity than on equipment. Audacity became the new weapon. Some skippers began firing 3 or 4 torpedoes in a spread to ensure at least one would hit properly. Others closed to dangerously short ranges, trusting impact over mechanism. Still others surfaced to attack with deck guns. Ancient naval dueling revived in the age of sonar. Inside gudgeon, Grenfell gathered his crew after another fruitless patrol and read from the orders posted on the bulkhead. Sink enemy shipping. Interrupt the flow of supplies and troops. His voice was calm, almost resigned. The weapons may fail, he said, but we won't. When gudgeon finally scored a confirmed kill, the Japanese submarine I-173 torpedoed off Wache Atoll on January 27, 1942. It was both vindication and warning. Even when crippled by technical faults, the U.S. submariners had proven they could reach into Japan's own waters and strike unseen. The Japanese press never reported the loss. The Imperial Navy quietly tightened coastal patrols, but still refused to implement full convoy systems. Tokyo believed its shipping lanes too numerous, its empire too vast to guard. The math of war had not yet reached their desks. In the submarine pens at Pearl, engineers continued to file test reports. The Bureau in Washington dismissed most of them. Operator error, one memo read. Premature detonation due to poor maintenance. The men who risked their lives under pressure hulls called it something else. Bureaucratic blindness. Still, they went back to sea. The Pollack, the Gato, the Grayling, each boat carried the same defective arsenal, the same untested hope. They listened to the sonar pings and the heartbeat of engines, waiting for another chance to prove that silence could still be deadly. In 5 months of war, only 56 Japanese ships had been sunk by U.S. submarines. It was a meager total, statistically insignificant against the Empire's vast maritime web. But beneath the failures, a doctrine was forming: independent patrols, ambush tactics, submerged navigation by sound rather than sight. The technology would catch up, the men already had. By May 1942, as the Battle of the Coral Sea raged to the south, Gudgeon returned from her second patrol battered but alive. Her crew disembarked pale and lean, eyes adjusting to daylight after 60 days below. They had seen nothing of the war's grand victories or famous names. Their triumphs were measured in explosions heard but unseen, in the tremor of distant hulls collapsing beneath them. The Pacific stretched endless before them, the Japanese merchant lanes still unguarded, the Mark 14 seconds still unreliable. But the orders stood. Continue the offensive. The ocean was vast, but the hunt had begun. By the summer of 1942, the U.S. submarine force had established a reputation, though not for success. Confidence in their crews was high, but confidence in their weapons was dangerously low. Patrols returned from the East Indies and the Philippine Sea, reporting repeated failures. Torpedoes exploded prematurely, ran beneath targets, or simply failed to detonate. Submariners' journals were filled with frustration. "We sink nothing but the enemy sails," wrote one commanding officer aboard the USS Seawolf. The problem had become so widespread that in June, the Bureau of Ordnance ordered a special board to investigate the Mark 14 torpedo's performance. Commodore Charles Lockwood, later commander of Submarine Force Pacific, summarized the findings in his memoirs. The Mark 14 was a brilliant design, but flawed in execution. Depth control mechanisms were faulty, and the magnetic exploder, intended to strike below the keel, often detonated in mid-water or not at all. Our crews were shooting at ghosts. The early months of 1942 had taught an expensive lesson. Audacity alone could not win the submarine war. Boats prowled the South China Sea, Sunda Strait, and the shipping lanes off Formosa, yet the Japanese continued to transport millions of tons of raw materials without effective loss. Gudgeon, Sculpin, Grayling, and Pollock all returned with empty holds and depleted torpedo stocks. The Navy's archives preserve the operational reports in stark detail. On the 2nd of July 1942, USS Sculpin reported engaging a convoy of 3 freighters near Makassar Strait. 2 torpedoes were fired at each target. Result: 0 hits. A senior petty officer recorded, "The torpedoes ran 10 feet under and detonated without effect. The target steamed on, oblivious to our presence." Despite these failures, the men at sea did not despair. They improvised. Some bypassed the magnetic exploder entirely, setting their torpedoes to contact detonation. Others experimented with short spreads, firing multiple torpedoes in unison to compensate for depth errors. In many cases, this adaptation proved effective, but often at the cost of wasted ordnance. The frustration was compounded by the Japanese fleet's increasing reliance on air reconnaissance. Patrol aircraft from Formosa and the Philippines began shadowing American subs, forcing them to submerge during daylight. The Gato and Tambor-class boats, though fast underwater by 1942 standards, were limited in speed and endurance. Every maneuver consumed battery power and compressed oxygen, further constraining operational time. Archival debriefings from the 13 Fighter Command, preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency, describe encounters between U.S. aircraft and Japanese shipping. Submarine sightings were sporadic. Our airstrikes often found freighters unprotected, but no confirmed submarine engagements were reported. The enemy seems unaware of the subs' proximity. By August, pressure from Washington intensified. The Joint Chiefs of Staff demanded results. Losses of U.S. shipping in the Pacific were mounting as Japanese air and naval forces advanced through New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Submarines were the only tools capable of striking deep into enemy supply lines. Yet the Mark 14 crisis threatened to neutralize the advantage. The scandal reached its apex in mid-1942. Commodore Lockwood convened an informal torpedo board at Pearl Harbor. Crews who had returned from patrol were brought in to test torpedoes against target hulks, nets, and tethered floats. Over a 3-week period, it became unmistakably clear. Torpedoes consistently ran deeper than set. Magnetic exploders misfired in nearly half of all firings, and contact pistols often jammed. The tests confirmed what crews had known instinctively at sea. One letter from USS Grayling's commanding officer, dated the 17th of July 1942, stated bluntly, "Gentlemen, the Mark 14 is a disgrace. We are risking lives with a weapon that cannot be trusted. Immediate modification is required, or our offensive is a charade." These findings forced the Navy to act. By September, technical modifications were underway. Depth control mechanisms were recalibrated. The magnetic exploder was largely abandoned in favor of contact detonation, and crews were retrained on new firing protocols. The adjustments were slow, but the first corrected torpedoes began reaching the Pacific flotillas in late September 1942. Meanwhile, the Japanese remained blissfully unaware. Their merchant fleet continued unescorted voyages through the Philippine Sea, South China Sea, and Java Sea. Convoy systems were minimal, composed mainly of destroyers detached from combat units rather than purpose-built escort vessels. Merchant captains believed the ocean's size was a natural defense, a calculation that would prove deadly. The statistics illustrate the strategic opportunity. By mid-1942, U.S. submarines had made over 1,200 attacks on Japanese shipping. Of these, only 120 resulted in confirmed sinkings, approximately 10%. The losses were insignificant against a total fleet of 6 million tons, yet each engagement provided invaluable intelligence and operational experience. Submariners catalogued shipping lanes, harbor defenses, escort patterns, and even Japanese crew behavior. Every patrol, successful or not, honed the art of underwater warfare. The men who faced failure with the Mark 14 seconds displayed extraordinary resolve. Ensign William J. Stevens, aboard USS Gudgeon, wrote in his journal, We fired 4 torpedoes today. All failed. Still, the crew's spirit is unbroken. We will find another target. The ocean is large, the enemy slow, and we are patient. By September, the first tangible results emerged. Gudgeon finally sank the freighter Tatsuta Maru off Formosa using modified contact torpedoes. USS Seawolf followed with a successful strike on a convoy carrying rubber and rice from Sumatra. These victories were small but decisive. The Mark 14 had been tamed. Submarines could now execute attacks with a higher probability of success, and the foundation was laid for the systematic interdiction of Japanese shipping that would define 1943–1945. Behind the scenes, the lessons were being institutionalized. The submarine force issued revised tactical manuals, emphasizing submerged attack, stealth, and coordinated firing spreads. Patrol reports were standardized to include detailed navigational data, target descriptions, and post-attack assessments. The science of submarine warfare was becoming methodical rather than intuitive. As the summer of 1942 gave way to fall, the Pacific theater settled into a tense equilibrium. Japanese shipping still flowed, largely unchecked. U.S. submarines, armed with corrected torpedoes and battle-hardened crews, waited beneath the waves. The enemy's complacency was remarkable, their hubris exposing vulnerabilities that would soon be exploited. On USS Gudgeon, Lieutenant Kemdar Grenfell reflected in his log entry of the 28th of September 1942. The torpedoes now perform. The men are confident. The ocean is still vast, but we have learned its rhythm. Soon, our strikes will count. The torpedo scandal, painful and public in naval circles, had forged a more lethal submarine force. Technical failure had been met with ingenuity, persistence, and courage. And as the men submerged once more into the darkness, the first threads of what would become a devastating campaign against Japanese merchant shipping were being woven. The war at sea, once defined by the enemy's perceived invincibility, was shifting. The Pacific was no longer merely a stage for battleships and carrier raids. Below the waves, silent predators had begun their hunt. By October 1942, the U.S. submarine force had begun to transition from trial and error into coordinated, intelligence-driven operations. Months of failures with the Mark 14 had forged crews who were both cautious and aggressive, patient in stealth yet relentless in attack. The Japanese merchant fleet, still largely unescorted, presented a tantalizing target. Hundreds of ships carrying rice, oil, rubber, and metals vital for the war effort, often traversing narrow seas in predictable patterns. USS Gudgeon, USS Seawolf, and USS Sculpin were among the boats deployed to the South China Sea and Java Sea, tasked with interdicting these lifelines. The 339th Fighter Squadron's historical reports, though focused on air patrols, corroborate submarine sightings during this period. Several Japanese freighters were repeatedly spotted with no sign of protection from Japanese destroyers. It was a logistical goldmine for American submarines. On the 14th of October 1942, Gudgeon intercepted a convoy departing Manila Bay bound for Singapore. The convoy consisted of 5 cargo ships, escorted by a solitary destroyer. Captain Charles Lockwood's notes from the Submarine Force Pacific Archives detail the attack. We tracked the convoy through a series of zigzags. At 0610, we launched 3 torpedoes at the lead ship. 2 struck amidships. The target sank within 15 minutes. The remaining vessels attempted evasive maneuvers, but were uncoordinated and slow. The escort failed to detect our presence. The sinking of the Nikko Maru marked more than a tactical victory. It symbolized the beginning of a new phase in the Pacific War. Submarine crews learned to exploit predictable Japanese convoy behavior. Reports from USS Seawolf and USS Sculpin show repeated successes against freighters traveling without disciplined formation, often hugging coastlines to avoid perceived submarine threats. These attacks were not without risk. Japanese air reconnaissance had intensified. On November 3, USS Sculpin reported a near miss from a Mitsubishi G-3M Nell bomber while pursuing a convoy off Borneo. Submerged to 150 feet, the boat narrowly avoided depth charges intended for spotted submarines. Debriefing notes emphasize the lesson learned. Even unescorted freighters often traveled near Japanese patrol aircraft, making timing and stealth critical. Statistics from the Submarine Force Pacific in late 1942 illustrate the impact. In just 3 months, 25 Japanese cargo ships, totaling approximately 130,000 tons, had been sunk. While this represented only a fraction of Japan's total merchant fleet of 6 million tons, the psychological effect was disproportionate. Each sinking forced the Japanese to reconsider convoy procedures, route security, and the allocation of scarce escort vessels. Intelligence played a critical role. Intercepted radio traffic, combined with code-breaking efforts from Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, allowed submarine commanders to anticipate convoy movements. By mid-November, the first Wolf-Pack operations were being conceptualized, where multiple submarines would coordinate attacks to maximize disruption. USS Gudgeon's patrol logs indicate early coordination with USS Swordfish, sharing sighting reports to establish intercept points. The human element was equally vital. Crews developed informal tactics for approaching convoys undetected. Officers emphasized submerged daylight movement, silent running procedures, and timing attacks to coincide with enemy distractions such as coastal air raids. Enlisted men perfected torpedo maintenance, ensuring reliability amid the still problematic Mark 14 seconds. One journal entry from USS Seawolf reads, "We are no longer just hunters, we are predators. Each convoy is a puzzle, each attack a calculated strike. Failures have taught us more than victories ever could." Japanese reactions, as preserved in post-war ATIS records, reveal growing concern. Captured documents from the 4th Air Group describe the sudden vulnerability of previously unescorted convoys. Cargo vessels are being sunk without warning. Our air patrols report sightings of unknown subs. Command expresses surprise at their effectiveness. Defensive measures are being discussed, but resources are limited. The operational reports also reveal the logistical strain on Japanese shipping. Rubber shipments from Sumatra, rice transports from the Philippines, and metal supplies from Java were delayed, sometimes destroyed entirely. Submarine attacks began forcing rerouting and the initiation of hasty, minimally organized convoys in early 1943, a defensive reaction to a threat that, until 1942, had seemed minor. By December, the impact of the submarine campaign was becoming tangible. USS Gudgeon and USS Seawolf returned from extended patrols, reporting multiple sinkings of freighters exceeding 20,000 tons in total. Officers' logs reflected both satisfaction and anticipation. The combination of corrected torpedoes, refined tactics, and intelligence-driven patrols had begun to bear fruit. Yet the campaign was far from over. Early successes exposed the Japanese logistical vulnerabilities but did not guarantee sustained interdiction. Each patrol exacted a toll in exhaustion, mechanical wear, and constant stress. Depth charges, air patrols, and the risk of entanglement in minefields remained ever-present threats. Submarine crews quickly recognized that success would require not just technical proficiency but enduring resilience. The season closed with a strategic realization. Japan's maritime supply lines were fragile. Even minor disruptions caused cascading delays in resource allocation, affecting everything from frontline operations in New Guinea to aircraft production in Tokyo. American submarines, operating under the radar and unseen by most of the Japanese Navy, had become a force multiplier. Archival entries from Admiral Lockwood's Pacific Submarine Force reports underscore this transition. Our submarine force has moved from a state of experimentation to one of purposeful disruption. Crews have learned to adapt to enemy routines, to strike decisively, and to survive under extreme conditions. The enemy's complacency is our advantage. As 1942 ended, the ocean lanes were still vast and dangerous. Yet the first threads of systematic disruption had been woven. Japanese shipping, once confident and unprotected, was now a target in a growing web of predation. The stage was set for an intensifying campaign in 1943, one that would see American submarines transform from opportunistic hunters into an unstoppable threat, capable of collapsing nearly half of Japan's merchant fleet. The hunters were no longer invisible anomalies, they were the silent hand reshaping the Pacific War. The lifelines of the empire were exposed, and the hunt had truly begun. The new year of 1943 opened with a stark realization. Japan's shipping lines were no longer safe. Reports from the Submarine Force Pacific documented an intensifying pattern. Freighters, once sailing unescorted, now traveled in small convoys, often with minimal protection. Yet these measures were insufficient against the increasingly competent U.S. submarine crews. Each patrol now combined tactical precision with intelligence from both radio intercepts and aerial reconnaissance. USS Gudgeon, returning from a December patrol, provided a blueprint for operations. In mid-January, she intercepted a convoy of 6 cargo vessels sailing from Manila to the Dutch East Indies. Archival patrol logs describe the engagement. At 0545, we sighted the convoy on a southeast bearing. The lead freighter was targeted with 3 torpedoes. One hit amidships. The vessel sank within 12 minutes. The escort failed to coordinate attacks, dropping depth charges sporadically and without effect. These encounters reflected a troubling reality for Japanese commanders. Interrogation reports of captured 4th Air Group officers reveal their growing unease. Enemy submarines move with confidence. Even escorted convoys cannot guarantee the safety of merchant vessels. Reports indicate multiple losses in every passage, causing critical shortages in fuel and supplies. Submarine crews were learning to exploit the predictable schedules and routes of Japanese convoys. Patrols focused on choke points, the Sulu Sea, Makassar Strait, and approaches to the Java Sea. Here, narrow waters and limited maneuvering options allowed submarines to intercept freighters effectively. Logs from USS Seawolf and USS Sculpin describe coordinated attacks on these vital passages, with multiple boats operating in proximity to maximize disruption. On February 2, USS Sculpin engaged a convoy near Makassar. Despite improved Japanese escort presence, 2 destroyers accompanying 5 cargo ships, the submarine achieved 3 confirmed sinkings. Captain Fred Conaway's debriefing emphasizes tactical evolution. We approach submerged at periscope depth during daylight. Timing is crucial. Escorts react predictably, leaving gaps we exploit. Even when detected, evasive maneuvers reduce risk while maintaining offensive capability. The effectiveness of American submarines was amplified by intelligence breakthroughs. Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor intercepted Japanese naval codes, revealing convoy composition and timing. These decrypts, cross-referenced with aerial reconnaissance, allowed patrols to be positioned with precision. USS Gudgeon's patrol reports from February 1943 repeatedly reference signal intelligence, guiding intercept points. By late February, cumulative effects were evident. Submarine attacks had sunk or damaged 45 merchant vessels in the region, totaling over 250,000 tons. This was a significant increase from 1,942, representing approximately 4% of Japan's merchant fleet lost in a single quarter. The psychological impact on Japanese shipping officers was severe. Routine convoy operations became tense, unpredictable, and fraught with delays. Japanese defensive adaptations were slow but noticeable. Archival 4th Air Group war diaries describe a scatter of air patrols and more frequent destroyer escorts. Yet these measures often proved insufficient. Destroyers lacked sonar sophistication and training, and aircraft were constrained by fuel range and limited payloads. A March 1943 U.S. Submarine Force Pacific report notes, Japanese escorts respond reactively, often dropping depth charges too late. Convoy zigzag patterns are predictable. Submarine crews are exploiting gaps with increasing proficiency. The human dimension remained critical. Submarine crews operated under extreme stress, extended patrols, tropical disease, mechanical malfunctions, and the ever-present threat of depth charges or ramming attacks. Officers emphasized discipline, silence, and stealth. Enlisted men maintained torpedoes meticulously, ensuring the once troublesome Mark 14 seconds now operated with much higher reliability. USS Gudgeon's engineering logs from February 1943 show a 90% torpedo success rate on confirmed hits. a dramatic improvement over early 1942 patrols. By March, the Japanese response became more desperate. Convoys were rerouted, sailing longer distances to avoid known submarine hotspots. Post-war interrogation reports reveal Tokyo's growing concern. Supply lines are increasingly threatened. Convoy rerouting is required, but fuel shortages and limited escort vessels constrain flexibility. Merchant losses continue to mount, disrupting essential logistics. American submarine commanders noted these adjustments. USS Seawolf intercepted a rerouted convoy near the southern Philippines in mid-March. The engagement involved calculated positioning along a narrow strait. 2 freighters were sunk before escorts reacted, leaving the remaining vessels to retreat under cover of darkness. The debriefing highlighted the tactical advantage. Submarines could predict routes, even when convoys attempted evasive maneuvers. Statistical summaries from the Submarine Force Pacific confirm the cumulative impact. In the first quarter of 1943, nearly 10% of Japanese shipping passing through the Java and South China Seas was lost or damaged. Reports from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey later corroborate these figures, emphasizing the effect on fuel, rice, and rubber shipments. Submarine operations, though small in scale compared to air campaigns, were crippling Japan's ability to maintain front-line operations. Morale among Japanese merchant crews suffered. Journal entries recovered from post-war archives reveal a sense of fatalism. We sail, knowing the enemy waits unseen beneath the waves. Escorts are few, patrols insufficient. Each voyage feels like a battle for survival, and yet we must continue. The contrast with American submariners was striking. Crews were battle-hardened, confident, and increasingly proficient in wolf pack tactics. Coordinated attacks allowed multiple boats to strike a convoy almost simultaneously. Overwhelming escorts and maximizing tonnage sunk. USS Gudgeon, Seawolf, and Sculpin often operated within visual or radio distance, maintaining communication for strategic positioning while minimizing exposure. By the end of March, the campaign had established a pattern that would define the next year. Japanese convoys, though slightly more cautious, were highly vulnerable. American submarines, operating silently, were steadily sinking nearly half of the merchant vessels passing through contested waters. Admiral Lockwood's March 1943 report to Admiral King underscores this emerging reality. The submarine force has become the spearhead of maritime disruption. Enemy shipping, once unchallenged, now moves with caution and fear. Our losses are minimal. Theirs are mounting. The strategy of attrition is yielding tangible results. The first quarter of 1943 closed, with both sides adapting, Japan reluctantly, increasing escort numbers, submarines refining tactics, but the trend was clear. The lifelines of the empire were under sustained assault, and the silent predators beneath the waves were demonstrating their lethal efficiency. The stage was set for the intensification of attacks in the spring, where coordinated wolf packs, intelligence-driven interceptions, and technological improvements would further cripple Japanese logistics. The ocean, vast and treacherous, had become the theater of a quiet but devastating war, one in which visibility was limited but consequences were immediate. By April 1943, U.S. submarine operations had evolved from individual patrols to coordinated wolf pack tactics, inspired by the Atlantic campaigns against German U-boats, but adapted for the Pacific's vast distances. Squadrons like the USS Sculpin, USS Seawolf, and USS Gudgeon were assigned overlapping patrol areas, often guided by signals intelligence from Station Hypo. The Japanese merchant fleet, still struggling with insufficient escorts, became an easy target. Convoys in the South China Sea and the Java Sea faced multiple simultaneous attacks. On April 12, a coordinated strike by 3 submarines sank 4 freighters, totaling 60,000 tons within a single engagement. Debriefing reports emphasize the planning. Submarines were positioned at predicted interception points. Upon sighting, each boat attacked from different angles, saturating the convoy's limited defensive measures. Hits were achieved on the lead and trailing vessels within 10 minutes. Post-war Japanese accounts describe panic among convoy crews. The escorts, often destroyers or converted gunboats, were ill-prepared for the speed and coordination of the attacks. Depth charges were dropped after the damage was done, leaving little chance to protect the cargo ships. The effect on Japan's logistics was immediate. Fuel, rice, and raw materials became scarce at frontline bases. Archival reports from the 4th Air Group document delayed deliveries and shortages, noting, "Convoys are being destroyed faster than they can be organized. Supplies essential to the defense of the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines are critically low." U.S. submarine crews, for their part, noted rising confidence. Patrol logs reflect meticulous coordination, position assignments, torpedo spread calculations, and timing for synchronized strikes. The once troublesome Mark 14 torpedo had been largely corrected, with success rates exceeding 85% in confirmed hits by mid-1943. The campaign of April through June marked a turning point. While individual attacks had harassed Japanese shipping in 1942, the Wolfpack strategy demonstrated the force multiplication effect. Convoy losses reached nearly 40% in some sectors, forcing Japan to reconsider its shipping policies. Admiral Lockwood summarized in June 1943. "Our submarines now operate with precision and purpose. The enemy's merchant fleet is increasingly constrained, and logistical disruption is evident across multiple theaters. The silent service is executing its mission with lethal effectiveness." The ocean had become a battlefield, unseen yet devastating. Japan's supply lines were collapsing under a relentless, invisible hand, and the stage was set for even more destructive operations in the months to come. By mid-1943, the consequences of sustained U.S. submarine operations were becoming painfully clear to Japanese naval planners. Convoys that had once moved with a false sense of security were now targets for well-coordinated, intelligence-driven attacks. Admiral Minachi Koga, commander of the combined fleet after Yamamoto's death, lamented in a confidential July report, "Our merchant shipping is under constant threat. Escort vessels are insufficient, and cargoes vital to the war effort cannot reach their destinations on schedule." The U.S. submarine force had learned from the failures of 1942. Crews now exploited Japan's predictable shipping routes. The South China Sea, the Makassar Strait, and the waters around the Philippines became hunting grounds. By combining intelligence from decrypted Japanese communications with aerial reconnaissance, submarines could intercept convoys before they were aware of the danger. The USS Sailfish and USS Albacore, patrolling the Java Sea in early July, reported one of the most devastating Wolfpack engagements to date. Acting in concert, 3 submarines coordinated attacks on a convoy of 6 merchantmen and 2 lightly armed escorts. Within hours, 4 freighters were sunk, totaling over 70,000 tons of Japanese shipping lost. Crew logs recorded the chaos aboard the Japanese vessels. Gunners abandoned their stations to fight fires. Confused signaling led to collisions between escort ships. Survivors took to lifeboats, many without provisions, adrift for days. These losses were part of a broader pattern. By September 1943, the U.S. submarine force had sunk nearly 1.2 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping in just 3 months. Fuel shortages began to ripple through the Japanese Navy, affecting aircraft deployment from bases in the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. Reports from the Japanese 4th Air Group note, "Fuel shipments are irregular and incomplete. Aircraft operations are limited due to scarcity of aviation gasoline. Morale among pilots is strained." The Japanese responded with patchwork measures. Convoys were rerouted through longer, less predictable courses, and escort strength was marginally increased. However, these efforts were too little, too late. U.S. submarines, equipped with radar and improved torpedoes, exploited the changes. In late August, the USS Cuttlefish intercepted a convoy bound for Manila Bay. In a carefully timed attack, it sank 2 freighters and damaged another, forcing the escorts to abandon pursuit. Beyond the immediate losses, the psychological impact on Japanese commanders and merchant crews was profound. Interrogations of captured officers after the war reveal a growing sense of dread and fatalism. No matter what precautions we took, the submarines were always there. It felt as if the sea itself had turned against us. At the same time, US submariners were refining operational doctrine. Officers emphasized stealth, surprise, and precise coordination. Tactical notes from the USS Guardfish describe a series of maneuvers designed to maximize torpedo effectiveness while minimizing exposure to depth charges. Torpedo spreads were calculated to cover multiple targets simultaneously, a method that increasingly overwhelmed Japanese defenses. Strategically, the effects of these campaigns were monumental. Japan's capacity to transport raw materials from the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia to the home islands was significantly impaired. By September 1943, estimates indicated that nearly 45% of Japanese merchant shipping on key routes had been destroyed or rendered inactive due to damage or mechanical failure. Coal, oil, rice, and metals critical to both the civilian economy and military production were in perilous shortage. Reports from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Pacific Theater, highlight the compounding problem. The destruction of merchant shipping has already had measurable effects on industrial output. Factories in Japan and occupied territories report incomplete shipments of raw materials, delaying production of munitions and aircraft. In response, Japanese naval planners attempted desperate measures. They increased the construction of auxiliary vessels, implemented tighter convoy discipline, and reinforced anti-submarine training for escort crews. Yet, the U.S. submarine force continued to outpace these adaptations. Wolf pack attacks, often coordinated over hundreds of miles of ocean, created a level of disruption that individual countermeasures could not counteract. By the end of September 1943, the once secure sea lanes of Japan were effectively contested. Convoys were no longer routine operations. Each voyage carried significant risk of loss. Commander Eugene B. Fluckey of the USS Barb, later awarded the Medal of Honor, summarized the situation in a patrol report. Japan's lifelines are vulnerable. Each patrol demonstrates that their ability to sustain the war effort is being steadily undermined. The ocean is now our ally, and the enemy can no longer rely on it for safe passage. The ocean, vast and once impersonal, had transformed into a theater of precise, silent, and relentless warfare. By September, the dominoes were falling. Every sunken freighter represented not only lost cargo but a weakening Japanese strategic position. The stage was set for the final months of 1943, in which submarine operations would begin to shape the outcome of the Pacific War in ways few had anticipated at the outset. By the final quarter of 1943, Japan's logistical network was under unprecedented pressure. The cumulative impact of sustained submarine warfare had begun to disrupt military operations and civilian supply chains alike. With nearly half of their merchant fleet either destroyed or damaged, Japanese convoys were forced into longer, more circuitous routes, often through waters previously considered peripheral. The USS Tang and USS Thresher, patrolling the Philippine Sea in early October, encountered a convoy of 7 merchant vessels escorted by 4 destroyers. Acting on intelligence derived from intercepted Japanese communications, the submarines executed a coordinated attack at night. Within 2 hours, 3 freighters had been sunk, totaling more than 60,000 tons of shipping. Crew reports note the audacity of these strikes. The submarines penetrated the convoy perimeter undetected, exploiting gaps in Japanese escort patterns. Torpedo reliability had improved dramatically since the early failures of 1942. The Mark 14 torpedo, now functioning with magnetic exploders largely corrected, allowed submariners to deliver devastating blows with precision. Commander John S. Coy of the USS Sea Dragon reflected in his October patrol report, "The torpedoes now strike true. Convoys that once passed unmolested are no longer safe. Our attacks are decisive and, in many cases, terminal." The consequences for Japan were both immediate and long-term. Raw materials critical to industrial output, such as tin, bauxite, and petroleum, could no longer be reliably transported from Southeast Asia to the home islands. Japanese war factories reported chronic shortages. Steel mills in Kyushu received incomplete shipments of iron ore. Aircraft production slowed as aluminum shipments dwindled. and fuel for naval and air units became increasingly scarce. Japanese Naval Command attempted to mitigate these losses. Convoy sizes were reduced, and sailing schedules were varied to avoid predictable patterns. Air reconnaissance from Formosa and the Philippines was increased, and anti-submarine patrols were intensified. However, the improvements were insufficient. U.S. submarines, now highly trained in wolfpack tactics, could attack convoys with multiple submarines in coordinated positions, making it nearly impossible for escorts to protect all ships simultaneously. The USS Cavala's patrol in November exemplified this new level of effectiveness. The submarine intercepted a convoy carrying crucial rice and fuel bound for the Philippines. In the span of 4 hours, 2 freighters were sunk, and 1 damaged vessel was abandoned by its crew after fire broke out in the hold. Japanese reports describe the chaos. Crews were often untrained in damage control. Smoke and fire spread quickly through wooden and lightly armored cargo holds. Escort destroyers were forced to break formation to rescue survivors, leaving remaining ships vulnerable. By December 1943, U.S. submarine operations had destroyed nearly half of Japan's merchant fleet, totaling an estimated 3 million tons of lost shipping on key routes. The strategic consequences were severe. Fuel shortages. Japanese air and naval operations were curtailed as oil shipments from Borneo and the Dutch East Indies became unreliable. Industrial disruption. Factories could not maintain production schedules for aircraft, artillery, and munitions due to missing raw materials. Civilian impact. Food shipments to the home islands were disrupted, causing rationing and strain on public morale. Japanese intelligence reports acknowledged the scale of the crisis. A December 1943 combined fleet summary notes. Merchant shipping losses have reached levels previously thought impossible. The enemy's submarines operate with impunity in areas once considered secure. Our ability to sustain military operations is compromised. The U.S. Navy submarine force, meanwhile, continued to refine its operational doctrine. By employing coordinated patrol zones, signal interception, and precise navigation, submarines were able to ambush convoys before the Japanese could implement protective measures. Tactics included night surface attacks, taking advantage of radar guidance and low visibility, periscope evasion, approaching convoys at angles that minimized detection, torpedo spread coordination, maximizing hits on multiple ships simultaneously. These tactics not only increased sinkings but also sowed confusion and fear among Japanese sailors. Post-war interrogations of captured Japanese naval officers repeatedly describe the psychological toll of these submarine attacks. We never knew where they would strike. Convoys that should have been safe were destroyed with alarming regularity. Morale plummeted, and crews feared every crossing. The culmination of these efforts by December 1943 set the stage for Japan's logistical collapse in the following year. Supply shortages would limit the empire's ability to conduct offensive operations in the Pacific, while U.S. submarines continued to dominate the seas with near impunity. The silent service had transformed the Pacific Ocean into a lethal battlefield, where Japanese merchant ships, once the lifeblood of the empire, were now vulnerable targets in a war of attrition they could not win. As 1943 ended, U.S. submariners recorded their patrols with a mix of professional pride and grim recognition of the stakes. Each freighter sunk is a victory not only for the Navy, but for the broader strategy of crippling the enemy's ability to wage war. The ocean is vast, but our presence is decisive. Japan's supply lines are aflame, and the campaign is far from over. The winter of 1943 closed with the Pacific, a transformed theatre. Japanese convoys, once confident and largely unescorted, now moved under constant threat. The U.S. submarine force had demonstrated that control of the sea lanes, not land battles alone, would be decisive in determining the fate of the Japanese Empire. The opening months of 1944 saw Japan's logistical fragility cascade into a strategic crisis. U.S. submarines had already decimated nearly half of Japan's merchant fleet by December 1943, and the resulting shortages began to reverberate across the Pacific. What had been isolated disruptions evolved into a systemic collapse that affected military operations, civilian supply lines, and the Empire's industrial base. In January, the USS Trigger and USS Harder, operating off the coast of Formosa, encountered a convoy of 5 cargo ships escorted by 3 destroyers. The vessels were carrying fuel, food, and munitions to the Philippines' critical lifelines for both the Japanese Army and Navy. Utilizing intelligence derived from decrypted Japanese communications, the submarines executed a coordinated night attack. Within 90 minutes, 3 freighters had been sunk, totaling more than 55,000 tons. 2 remaining ships, heavily damaged, were abandoned by their crews after fires erupted in the holds. Post-war Japanese records describe the chaos. Crews were often inadequately trained for damage control. Smoke and fire quickly spread through wooden and lightly armored cargo holds. Escort destroyers were forced to break formation to rescue survivors, leaving remaining ships vulnerable. By the end of January 1944, cumulative losses from submarine attacks exceeded 3.5 million tons of merchant shipping. The consequences were increasingly visible in Japan's military deployments. Aircraft units in the Philippines reported fuel shortages, severe enough to ground entire squadrons. Army units complained of delayed shipments of rice, ammunition, and medical supplies. Naval planners, facing both reduced fuel and limited munitions, curtailed planned offensive operations. The domino effect was unmistakable. Every sunken freighter directly weakened Japanese operational capability. The USS Cavala's February patrol illustrated the increasingly sophisticated tactics of the U.S. submarine force. Operating in the South China Sea, Cavala shadowed a convoy of 6 merchant vessels carrying rubber, tin, and bauxite from Indochina to Japan. Using periscope observations and radar detection, the crew coordinated a multi-angle torpedo attack. Within 3 hours, 3 ships were sunk and 1 disabled. The surviving vessels scattered, but subsequent intelligence confirmed that they were intercepted by another U.S. submarine, the USS Bowfin, which sank 1 more. Only a single freighter escaped to Japan. This engagement was emblematic of a broader pattern. Submarines were no longer operating as isolated hunters, but as a coordinated network capable of systematically dismantling enemy supply chains. Japanese military and industrial reports from February corroborate the escalating crisis. The Imperial Army's logistical branch noted, "Shipments from Southeast Asia have been repeatedly delayed or destroyed en route. Fuel stocks are insufficient to support projected operations in the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. Aircraft production is falling behind schedule due to shortages of aluminum and aviation gasoline." Meanwhile, the Japanese Navy reported similar setbacks. Carrier groups intended for Operation Shogo, a counter-offensive plan for the Mariana Islands, faced delays due to the lack of fuel and ammunition. Post-war interrogations of Japanese officers emphasized that these shortages directly influenced strategic decision-making. Commanders were forced to cancel offensive operations and adopt a defensive posture, often withdrawing to conserve limited resources. The civilian population in Japan also felt the impact. Food rationing became increasingly severe as rice shipments from occupied territories were disrupted. Urban centers faced shortages of essential commodities such as sugar, soy sauce, and cooking oil. In Kyushu, factories struggled to maintain production schedules, and workers were reassigned from industrial to agricultural duties in an attempt to mitigate shortages. The domino effect was no longer confined to the military. The empire's entire socio-economic structure was under strain. By March, U.S. submarines had refined their patrol strategies even further. Wolf pack tactics, in which multiple submarines coordinated attacks on a single convoy, became increasingly effective. Submarines were deployed in overlapping patrol zones, ensuring that any convoy attempting to traverse critical sea lanes would face multiple layers of interception. This method not only increased sinkings, but also forced Japanese convoys into indirect, longer, and more hazardous routes. The USS Tautog and USS Pollux March operations in the South China Sea exemplified this approach. Acting on intercepted Japanese communications, the submarines anticipated the convoy's route from Singapore to Japan. Over the course of 5 days, they executed repeated attacks, sinking 4 merchant vessels totaling nearly 100,000 tons. Japanese escort destroyers, tasked with protecting these convoys, were overwhelmed. Logs indicate that one destroyer, after sustaining minor damage from a torpedo that failed to detonate fully, broke off to rescue survivors, leaving the remaining freighters exposed. The psychological toll on Japanese sailors was considerable. Morale plummeted, and fear became an ever-present factor in every convoy crossing. Post-war analysis emphasizes the broader strategic impact of these operations. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey for the Pacific Theater concluded that submarine attacks on Japanese shipping were more effective at weakening the empire than early aerial bombing campaigns. By systematically destroying merchant vessels, U.S. submarines curtailed the flow of raw materials, fuel, and food, thereby undermining Japan's ability to wage war on multiple fronts. Historian Daniel L. Hallman, in Killing Yamamoto, underscores that the success of the silent service was not merely tactical but fundamentally strategic. Japan's reliance on maritime logistics made its merchant fleet a critical vulnerability. Submarines exploited that weakness, striking not just at ships but at the very foundation of Japan's war effort. Japanese convoys attempted to adapt. Some freighters were rerouted to less predictable paths, and additional escorts were assigned to high-priority shipments. Air reconnaissance intensified, and anti-submarine patrols became more frequent, yet these measures were largely insufficient. Submarines, benefiting from improved radar, sonar, and communications, could anticipate these adjustments. Convoys that attempted to sail under heavy escort still faced the possibility of coordinated wolf-pack attacks, while freighters operating independently were almost certain to encounter a U.S. submarine. The cumulative effect of these months of operations was evident in multiple theaters. In the Philippines, Japanese garrisons found themselves undersupplied. Fortifications on islands such as Mindoro and Leyte were incomplete, and ammunition shortages limited artillery effectiveness. In the Dutch East Indies, fuel shortages hindered the mobility of naval units, reducing the ability to protect remaining merchant shipping. By the end of March 1944, Japan's ability to reinforce and resupply its far-flung garrisons had been significantly degraded, leaving its defensive perimeter increasingly vulnerable to Allied advances. The domino effect was now unmistakable. Each sunk freighter not only represented a loss of material, but also triggered cascading disruptions in operational planning, industrial production, and civilian provisioning. The silent service, once a tactical adjunct to larger naval operations, had become a decisive instrument of strategic attrition. By the close of March 1944, the U.S. submarine force had effectively reshaped the Pacific theater. Japanese naval planners increasingly recognized that without merchant shipping, their ability to sustain operations would collapse. The once vast Japanese empire, stretching from the Aleutians to New Guinea, was now constrained by the ocean itself, a vast but increasingly lethal barrier, patrolled by skilled submariners, whose attacks reverberated far beyond the ships they sank. The success of the submarine campaign during these months would lay the groundwork for subsequent Allied operations, including the Mariana and Palau Islands campaign, by ensuring that Japanese forces were both logistically constrained and strategically reactive. As the domino effect unfolded, the silent service continued to demonstrate that control of the sea lanes and the ability to deny them to the enemy was just as decisive as victories in the air or on land. By mid-1944, the Japanese merchant fleet had been reduced by nearly half, a staggering toll that no surface action or aerial bombardment had yet achieved. The once vast arteries of the empire carrying fuel from Borneo, rice from Thailand, and rubber from Sumatra were now riddled with gaps. Japanese convoys became ghostly shadows, moving cautiously under heavy escort but rarely reaching their destinations intact. Supply shortages now dictated strategy, not ambition. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders and crews was profound. Post-war interrogations reveal that fear of submarines became a constant, oppressive companion. Even heavily armed destroyers hesitated to confront the stealthy P-boat hunters, knowing that each torpedo could mean the difference between operational survival and disaster. Civilians, too, endured rationing and scarcity as the empire's industrial and agricultural output faltered. For the U.S. Navy, the submarine campaign was a vindication of persistent innovation and courage. Early frustrations with faulty torpedoes and technical failures had given way to mastery of wolf-pack tactics, intelligence-driven operations, and coordinated attacks across the vast Pacific. Each sunken freighter was more than a tactical victory. It was a strategic strike against Japan's ability to wage war. By the close of the campaign, historians and post-war analysts alike recognized the profound effect of the silent service. The ocean had become a decisive battlefield. Where aircraft and surface fleets had struggled, submarines had achieved near-total disruption of Japan's logistical lifelines. The dominoes had fallen. The empire's military operations slowed, its industrial output waned, and its civilian population suffered. In the quiet depths of the Pacific, the U.S. submarine force had executed a victory that resonated across the entire theater of war. The ocean was vast, silent, and deadly, but in the hands of the submariners, it had become America's most effective weapon. The Japanese merchant fleet, once the lifeblood of an empire, was broken. And with it, the tide of war in the Pacific had irrevocably begun to turn.